Hello and welcome to your lecture on the Bronze Age collapse. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. By the year 1350 BC, the world that we saw begin in the agricultural revolution had grown up. Those first small settlements built around chapels had grown to cities, had grown to empires. These empires controlled the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. They ruled vast territories of land, had complicated governments and religions, beautiful art and architecture, and a high standard of living. Among these major civilizations, you'll recognize our old friends, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans. These empires were not isolated. On the contrary, they were very much connected. Everyone traded with each other. Kingdoms depended on buying and selling things from other kingdoms, grain from Egypt, copper and tin to smelt into bronze from the Hittites. Despite their differences and occasional tiffs and wars, the rulers of these various kingdoms got along so well that historians today call them the Club of Great Powers. What countries would a modern-day Club of Great Powers contain? How about the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, China, Japan, France, Germany? These countries don't always agree with each other. They don't always get along, but for the most part, they maintain their trading ties because they know that their economies depend on one another. This interconnectedness, whether today or back during the Bronze Age, is overall a strength. It enables countries to get goods and sell goods they otherwise wouldn't be able to. It strengthens the economy. It makes the countries richer and their lives better. But like all strengths, it can also be a weakness, because if something happens to one country, the other countries suffer as well. And nowhere was that weakness more apparent than during the Bronze Age collapse, when this mighty world that had been built all of a sudden crumbled. The Bronze Age collapse is a period of time from about 1250 to about 1150 BC, when civilization collapsed. Look at the extent of the Egyptian Empire in 1250 BC, right at the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse. By the end of it, Egypt had lost all of her land outside the Nile River Valley. And yet she was the lucky one, because all the other major civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East had disappeared. They had vanished completely. Major cities were destroyed or became ghost towns. There was widespread death and devastation, along with migration, leaving your home to go live somewhere else. Whenever you see large-scale migration, it's usually because people are running away from something. Their cities are destroyed, their livelihoods are gone, and so they pack up and leave in hopes of finding a better life somewhere else. And the sheer scale of migration during the Bronze Age collapse shows just how bad things were, that so many people felt they had to pack up, leave, and try to start a new life in a more secure location. The effects of the Bronze Age collapse were different depending on where you lived. They were especially bad in Greece. Greece entered what is known as the Greek Dark Age. People forgot how to write, they forgot how to paint, they forgot how to work stone. Do you remember that gorgeous palace at Knossos? This awe-inspiring, sprawling palace complex was built by the Minoans 500 years before the Bronze Age collapse. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Greeks couldn't have built something like this. They didn't have the skill in stone. They didn't have the skill in painting to create frescoes like this. They couldn't create frescoes at all. How does an entire culture forget how to read, how to write, how to paint, how to work stone? Here is Joe. Joe knows how to read and write. In fact, he uses these skills daily at his job. He's very good at Linear B. But then one day something terrible happens. Joe's city burns down. The people who employed him are all dead. Joe doesn't have a job anymore. Joe doesn't have a home anymore. He decides to try to make a new life elsewhere. He migrates. Joe moves to a mountain village where he begins to farm. Farming is very hard work, especially if you're not used to it, and Joe finds himself doing back-breaking labor from sunup to sundown just to get enough food to survive. Despite his busy schedule, Joe does find some room for romance, and soon he has married a beautiful young woman who still has most of her teeth, named Joette. Jouett does not know how to read and write herself. Being female, and from being from a small mountain village, she never had the opportunity to learn. The two lovebirds have 7 beautiful children, and while some of them do die from disease early on in infancy, most of them survive. Now they have to grow enough food to support both themselves and their children. There's no time for the children to try to go to school or for Joe to try to teach them how to read and write. They need to be working the farm, and work the farm they do. Unfortunately, that means that in this family anyway, by the time the children are grown and having children of their own, the art of reading and writing has already been lost. Even if by this point times are better and they're starting to grow more food than they can eat, these parents, even if they wanted to teach their children how to read and write, don't know how to themselves and so are unable to. Now imagine the story of Joe and Jouett occurring across an entire nation, across an entire culture. Times were so bad during the Bronze Age collapse that they needed to focus on surviving. And when the choice is between keeping the art of writing alive and putting food on the table, people are going to choose food. But that means that reading and writing, art, and the working of stone become lost, and those skills would not be regained for centuries. The Greek Dark Age is called dark for a couple reasons. First, because it was a really hard time to live. Secondly, because without written records, it's really hard to know anything about it. It was dark not just for the people living through it, but for us trying to look back at it. The question then becomes, what caused the Bronze Age collapse in the first place? What could possibly cause multiple major civilizations that had lasted for centuries, if not millennia, to suddenly topple in a span of 100 years? The answer is that one disaster could probably not have toppled these empires. Instead, the Bronze Age collapse was probably caused by a combination of disasters. One of these was invasion. The Sea Peoples, a group of seafaring tribes, otherwise known as pirates, had a very aggressive approach to migration. They ransacked cities, burned them, and built their own settlements in their place. This Egyptian painting shows Pharaoh Ramses III defeating the Sea Peoples, driving them back. Other rulers were not so successful. Invasion definitely can have the effect of destabilizing governments and depleting the military and overall putting governments in a bad position. However, the Sea Peoples alone were not responsible for the Bronze Age collapse. If it had been just them, maybe some civilizations would have been in trouble, but for the most part, they probably would have been beaten back and just become a footnote in history. But it wasn't just the pirates. There was also drought. Drought is a long period of time without rain. Without rain, crops die, and without food, people starved. We know that there was drought and subsequent food shortages during the period of the Bronze Age collapse, firstly because we have a lot of first-hand accounts written during that time period of people despairing because their families are starving, their towns are wasting away, people begging for food, for anything to be sent. We also know there was drought because of tree ring analysis. Tree ring analysis is when you look at the rings of a tree that was growing during a certain period of time, and you use those rings to tell you something about the kind of weather or events that were going on during that time. In the case of drought versus not drought, when there's drought, because there's not very much water, the tree isn't able to grow very much, so the rings on a trunk will be very narrow. On the other hand, during a rainy year, the tree is able to grow more, and so the tree ring will be wider. By using tree ring analysis, people have discovered that there were years of drought during the Bronze Age collapse, thereby supporting all those first-hand accounts and showing that times must have been very hard indeed. Earthquakes in the Mediterranean were nothing new. Each member of the Club of Great Powers would have been familiar with earthquakes and familiar with what it required to rebuild after them. Some of them even had early forms of earthquake proofing for their buildings. What they were not prepared for was an earthquake storm. An earthquake storm is when a massive earthquake weakens the fault line and causes years of subsequent earthquakes. In the case of the Bronze Age collapse period, evidence suggests that there was a 50-year-long earthquake storm from about the years 1175 to 1225 BC. Notice how nicely those years, 1175 to 1225, are sandwiched between the longer years of the Bronze Age collapse, 1250 to 1150 BC. That many earthquakes had to have caused a major headache for these civilizations. Combined with drought and invasion, it's no wonder that they started to look a little shaky. Yet, maybe if it had just been invasion and drought and an earthquake storm, they could have survived, or at least some of them could. But wait, there's more, because now we enter disease. When people are malnourished or starving, they're much more likely to get sick, and it becomes a lot harder for them to recover from being sick. Although the Black Plague is a likely candidate, we don't know exactly what disease or diseases ravaged already starving populations, especially in the cities, and killed them off like flies. Whatever it was nasty. Disease was likely spread by ships. Remember, all these nations are trading with each other. Ships are going from port to port to port. So if people in one area of the world are sick, it's not going to be long before people everywhere else have that same sickness. Disease was likely also spread by a lack of clean drinking water. Getting clean drinking water, again, especially in the cities, was always an issue. But as structures and government started to break down, it became even harder to get clean drinking water. And when you drink water that has animal feces or human feces in it, you get sick. It's pretty gross. We can't just blame the ships and the lack of clean drinking water for the disease spread, however, because migration was also a factor. Remember, migration is when you leave one area to go live somewhere else. Well, people were fleeing cities destroyed by fire, racked by plague, and when they left and went to go live somewhere else, they would bring the sickness with them. Invasion, natural disasters, disease. That's a pretty deadly cocktail for any civilization. If these civilizations had been self-sufficient, in other words, if they only relied on themselves, then faced with this combination of disasters, some of them would probably have fallen. Some of them would have been left clinging to their existence by their fingernails. But they weren't self-sufficient, were they? They weren't isolated. On the contrary, they were connected by a complicated web of trade routes and alliances. They depended on each other. And that meant that the domino effect came into play. The domino effect in this case means that when one country fell, it brought the others down with it. One by one, the various empires fell. Their strength, that connection, became their weakness. And that is how, in the span of only about 100 years, almost every major civilization around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East puffed out of existence. Sometimes, writes Eric Klein in his book on the Bronze Age collapse, it takes a large-scale wildfire to help renew the ecosystem of an old-growth forest and allow it to survive afresh. The wildfire of the Bronze Age collapse might have wiped out the great civilizations, but in the ashes left behind, it gave an opportunity for the world to reinvent itself. The collapse of all the civilizations that had depended on bronze for their tools and weapons paved the way for a new metal, iron. The Iron Age, which lasted from about 1200 to 550 BC, was when people used iron for their tools and weapons. Iron wasn't necessarily that much stronger than bronze, but it was less brittle. It was less likely to break than bronze weapons. And when you have an iron sword and a bronze sword clashing in a fight, that becomes pretty important. If your sword breaks, the other person wins. And iron won this particular fight. Iron was also easier to find than bronze. Remember, to get bronze, you have to have two different metals, tin and copper. With iron, you only need one metal, iron, and you're good to go. Just like the burning down of old-growth trees can give young shoots the opportunity they need to thrive, so too did the fall of great civilizations allow younger nations to grow and prosper. One of these was the Hebrews. In the book of Exodus, the mighty hand of God delivers the Hebrew slaves from Egyptian bondage, leads them through the desert and into the promised land. But look at the world before the Bronze Age collapse. Can you imagine the Hebrews escaping Egypt only to go into Egypt? Wouldn't have been too great. But after the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt has been reduced to just this land along the Nile River Valley. This land is free for the Hebrews to move on in. This is only one example of a people given an opportunity by the fall of other civilizations. Next week, we'll look at another people sprouting up in the ashes of empires. These were some of the best sailors and smartest businessmen the world has ever seen. I refer, of course, to the Phoenicians. See you next week.